The French word peintre, or painter, was not used in the feminine form. In the middle of the 19th century, for Berthe Morisot, a girl from a good family, this was something of a challenge. She became the first woman of the group of Impressionists alongside of Degas, Monet, and Renoir. They thought of her as their equal. Because he could only paint in his radical style, Edouard Manet was a man of scandal. While still alive, he would only be criticized, insulted, and mocked. As both came from the French upper class, their meeting was inevitable. Their relationship lasted 15 years. 15 years that still today are surrounded by mystery. Why did these two extremely free-minded artists come together? What kind of a painting duo were they? Did they work together, or were they rivals? Never did Edouard Manet paint the same woman so many times. And even though in the end Berthe Morisot became his sister-in-law, did they have a secret love affair? It was at the Louvre Museum in 1868 that the painter Fontaine-Latour set up the meeting. Berthe and her sister Edma were studiously copying the Grand Masters there. All student painters did this. Manet was already an accomplished artist. 5 years earlier, he had made headlines with his Olympia and then his Déjeuner sur l'herbe, lunch in the grass.
Manet was a man of scandal. Théophile Gautier, who backed his earliest efforts several years later, stepped away from this painting that he found too radical. Gautier himself said, "Monsieur Manet has the honor of being a danger." And I think that this excited the young Berthe Morisot, who was 10 years younger than Manet. We can feel this in the correspondence between Berthe Morisot and her sister Edma. The man fascinated her, because he was the subject of scandal, but also because he was so self-confident.
There is a well-known letter by Manet written to his friend Henri Fontaine-Latour at the very moment when the two artists met the Morisot sisters, that is, Berthe and Edma, whom he found to be charming.
The two Morisot sisters are charming. What a shame they're not men. It could, however, serve the cause of painting as women, if each married an academic.
At first he was totally condescending, saying that the only quality for a woman was to marry an academic.
It does not appear that Manet was suddenly overwhelmed by her presence. But when they met at the Louvre in the winter of 1868, though he decided that the girl could teach him nothing about painting, her beauty and charm did have an effect on him. Very quickly, Manet asked her to pose for him, for a painting he was putting together called The Balcony.
Manet was distancing himself from Victorine Meurent, the model for his earliest paintings, Olympia, The Lunch, Woman in Paris. He was looking for something else in his painting, to paint the modern world. During the Second Empire, artists were leaving the Spanish black painting style to use a more modern palette and style to depict the era. He needed a model, a woman to represent this modern world. This would be Berthe Morisot between 1868 and 1874 in a series of striking canvases, all different, in which Berthe Morisot would play a role and have a strong presence.
For Berthe, who dreamed of being a painter, meeting Manet was very important. Finally, she had been introduced to a highly unusual artist. But he did have real magnetism. Though he was married, Edouard Manet enjoyed multiple female conquests. Few men have been as seductive, his friend Antonin Proust wrote about him. Was Berthe able to resist? Did she give in?
That is the question. Did Berthe Morisot and Edouard Manet have a love affair? It is difficult to say, but I think not.
Frankly, I know nothing about it.
We can imagine many things based on the paintings. Paintings do speak, but the documents are missing. So a historian cannot prove by A plus B that Edouard Manet and Berthe Morisot had a love affair.
It is indeed impossible to find any proof of a romantic attraction between Berthe and Manet. Not a single word, not a single letter. And yet, throughout her life, Berthe corresponded heavily not only with her family, her sister Edma, but also with her friends. So how can we explain the absence of any written trace of an exchange with Manet, despite their having spent much time together during 15 years' time?
There is no trace of any romantic correspondence between Berthe Morisot and Manet. If there were ever any letters that were a little warmer or at least less ambiguous, then they no longer exist.
A little as if someone had worked at destroying any precise trace of this relationship. Sometime before she died, she confided in one of her friends, Louise Riesner, the daughter of a great painter. She told her, "Better destroy the love letters. That is the only trace we have that allows us to assume that there was a kind of personal autodafé by Berthe Morisot concerning Edouard Manet." The soft, wonderful hours remain untouched. Do we need material objects to look at them again as relics? That is quite vulgar. Better burn the love letters.
No letters, no confession. Would there be elsewhere any indication of a possible romance?
The attraction Manet felt for Berthe was obvious in his insistence to paint her portrait.
Manet depicted Berthe Morisot 14 times in his own painting. That is more times than any other model. Even Victorine Meurent, who posed a lot for Manet, never posed as much as Berthe Morisot. Berthe was not a model. She was first and truly a lady from the bourgeoisie. She was also an artist herself. And yet she agreed to spend long hours in Manet's studio.
The paintings are loaded with desire, forbidden desire. But what is wonderful about these paintings is that we perceive their acuity. We perceive the strength and the stating of the impossible. And Manet was the only one capable of painting that between 1868 and 1874.
And of course, the emblematic painting for this love story, if there was one, was Berthe Morisot with Bouquet of Violets. Violets are the flowers of modesty, of discretion, so they fit Berthe perfectly, since Berthe was a very reserved woman, very secretive, and at the same time, violets represent secret love, private love. The funny thing is that after doing this painting, which he painted in his studio at Rue Saint-Petersburg, Manet did another very small canvas that simply depicted the bouquet of violets, an immortal bouquet since it would never dry. It was a painted bouquet, and he wrote, "To Berthe, Manet."
Manet.
(1874) was a decisive year for Berthe Morisot. At age 33, she finally decided to get married. That same year, the painter did her portrait one last time. After that, Berthe would never again pose for Manet.
She was painted in profile, which was quite rare in Manet's portraits. The composition was very vivid. Her fan was open, and the fan was the accessory for seduction. She was wearing a ring, said to be an engagement ring. So Manet wanted to capture this moment, which was a downturn in their relationship.
Had social constraints, morals, and good manners crushed a possible passion?
There are many mysterious points. For example, we don't know if Berthe posed alone in Manet's studio. She mostly posed in Rue Saint-Petersburg, where he was using an old fencing room he had made into a studio and that had a special atmosphere. All his contemporaries described this studio, which was full of flowers. Manet painted flowers a lot, but he also enjoyed being surrounded with flowers, so the place was full of bouquets. There were very strong flower scents, and he had deep couches. He welcomed many models. There sometimes were forgotten female clothes on one of the couches. So Berthe was entering what was almost a bachelor's place. It really was the painter's studio. We know very well that he was painting nude females. So was she alone? I don't think so, since at the time, young girls were never left alone to pose.
Because there was not only a risk for their reputation, but mostly there was a risk to have children. Especially since, as you know, Manet himself had a few problems on his side, having contracted syphilis in his youth. So it was very hard to have a relationship without immediately it leading to marriage.
Le mariage.
On January 24, 1874, Berthe Morisot lost her father. Then in December of the same year, still in her grieving clothes, she wore black to marry a Manet, Eugène Manet, Édouard's brother.
Why Eugène? Here we might have to look into her subconscious.
There was this terrible letter in which she wrote, I think to her sister, "In the end, my situation was unbearable. I lived off illusions for too long. He is an honest boy. He loves me too." So it was a marriage of convenience more than love. And this letter was terrible because she was saying that, in fact, the one she loved was the other brother.
I don't think so. I mean, it is more of an opinion than scientific proof, but Eugène Manet was also an endearing character. The Manet brothers in general seemed to be very endearing. Eugène also had a very interesting trajectory. Once he married Berthe, the roles would be inverted. He gave up painting, which he might have practiced as an amateur, and did everything to support his wife's work. And that is absolutely extraordinary.
Whether this was a marriage of convenience or a harmonious marriage, Berthe would experience in 1878 the most intense happiness, the birth of her daughter, Julie. This was her life's treasure, who would literally grow up under her mother's brushstrokes. The paradox of the upper class, to which both Berthe and Manet belonged, was to have artists suddenly emerge unexpectedly. creatures entirely possessed by the demon of painting or poetry. Did Berthe and Manet have to place their art above all convention? Did Berthe, the daughter of a court official, have to fight to be authorized to live her passion?
She had a very strict education, as did all young upper-class girls at the time. They did not go out alone. They were watched closely. There always had to be someone accompanying them.
There was indeed social etiquette that restricted movement for a female artist in Berthe Morisot's milieu. Again, this was probably linked to the privileged milieu that she was from. Some things were acceptable, some other things were not, for a young woman from high society.
In general, we associate artists with bohemia, with financial difficulty and so on. It was not at all the case with Berthe Morisot, who indeed could work at home, not in a studio, because she was an artist without a studio who painted at home, always surrounded by her people, whether her parents when she was younger, before her marriage, or here in the countryside, in this Menil castle that was to become a wonderful family house. And this makes her extremely touching and also a little mysterious, because in the end, out of this classic milieu that was conventional and was 19th century upper class, well, a real artist would be born with her sensitivity and her own approach to painting.
In the Manet household, it was not any more acceptable for Édouard to become a professional artist. He was the son of a senior civil servant at the Justice Ministry and was not at all destined for paintbrushes. Having failed to make him a magistrate, his father insisted on making him enlist in the Navy, to no avail.
He was the eldest of three brothers. According to upper-class logic, he was obliged to follow in his father's footsteps. However, this was also a smart family, obviously. And they finally understood that he was not made for law. So they ended up accepting to see him enter a painting studio. And not any studio. It was Thomas Couture's studio, an artist who in the Second French Republic was very prominent. He was a key artist of the Second Republic, and he received requests for paintings. He was a Republican, close to the regime, which also gave indications as to the way Manet was later going to build his career. He was a man who agreed not to be trained at the Beaux-Arts school, not to follow the traditional curriculum, to be an independent artist, but to be close to the government in place.
It was in the studio of Thomas Couture that Manet painted The Absinthe Drinker. It was the first painting to bring him great praise from critics. Berthe's training was not particularly academic either, but at the time, the Beaux-Arts school was off-limits to women. Madame Morisot, the mother, enrolled her two daughters in a painting class in Joseph Guichard's studio.
So the young woman developed a passion and received very classical training. First drawing, then color, through copying at the Louvre, especially Véronese's work. But what Berthe loved most was working outdoors, and Joseph Guichard, recognizing this passion, recommended her to Corot, whose student she became, along with her sister Edma.
Camille Corot painted outdoors. He introduced Berthe and her sister Edma to the lyricism and romanticism of landscapes, painted according to nature. And in order for their two daughters to practice with the master, their parents did not hesitate to rent a house near the pond in the town of Ville d'Avray, near Paris, in the summer of 1861. But Berthe's milieu frowned upon working women. Their femininity was only acknowledged by entertaining guests, marriage, and motherhood. Edma, Berthe's beloved sister, gave in to parental pressure, and in 1869 she married a naval officer. She moved to Lorient and gave up painting forever. Berthe was devastated, but there was no way for her to give up her dreams, no way to renounce her sensitivity and her artistic nature.
Berthe Morisot was a rebellious woman. She did not conform with what was expected of her. She should have had a bourgeois destiny, simply be a mother, take care of the house as her mother did, serve tea to her friends. This was the predetermined fate ahead of her.
And what Berthe Morisot was never going to do was definitely get back into line. She was never going to sacrifice her painting for her life. So she managed to create a remarkable synthesis between her life as a woman, her life as a mother, and her life as a painter. But never would she sacrifice her painting. That is probably what deeply distinguished her from the women of her time.
I would say that the word rebellious is a bit violent to describe her. George Sand was rebellious. She was an activist. There was no activism in Berthe. There was a desire to exist in painting, to express herself.
I don't think we can call Berthe Morisot rebellious, because she did conform to certain expectations of what a woman from her milieu should be. So she was not rebellious, but certainly fiercely independent, yes, very determined.
All that I have been doing for so long seems to me to be so horribly bad that I wish I had new material, and especially better material to show the public. Contrary to her painting, in which white dominated, painting with pastel tones, happy-style paintings, Berthe Morisot was a pained woman. She sometimes got angry, had outbursts. For example, one day, she completely destroyed her youthful paintings, which she found to be imperfect.
With such a powerful character, Berthe was permanently seeking the perfect stroke. Totally focused, she lived only for painting, around which her life revolved. Was Manet the victim of the same torment? Did he also have to revolt?
I don't think we can attribute only one definition to Manet, notably that of a rebel. This does not match his social status or his social and commercial ambitions. Nor does it match his behavior facing institutions and the critics of the time. He presented himself in the art world as a student of fashion. At the time of the Second Empire and the Second Republic, he went up against the jury of the art salon, and he did well, as he was awarded a medal in 1861.
While Manet agreed to have a career to honor his parents, he could not ignore what his temperament dictated. He refused to adapt his painting to academic rules. In 1863, at the express request of Emperor Napoleon III, the Salon des Refusés was created to include the 2,000 painters excluded from the Paris Salon. Manet was one of them. This is where he exhibited his lunch on the grass and triggered his first real scandal.
Lunch on the grass, obscene. Never before had anyone painted more appalling lines and loud tones.
This painting shocked a great deal at the time, as it shows a naked model conversing without modesty with two fully dressed men. In the background, a woman is bathing. All of this was executed in a manner that was very frank and without any regard for perspective. The female nude had absolutely no respect for the usual rules for the models, nor for female sensuality. It was a very frank, iconographic execution, a disturbing subject for the public. So this painting created a scandal.
Olympia, a dirty virgin. Olympia, this yellow-bellied slave.
At the 1865 Paris Salon, Manet attacked the traditional female nude theme and again provoked turmoil with Olympia, painted 2 years earlier.
Manet was blamed for introducing modern subjects in large format, which was the format of historical painting. And not just any subjects. Whether it was the luncheon on the grass or Olympia, the woman was no longer the ideal nymph and had become the Second Empire woman, undressed. In both cases, it was no longer an academic nude, but a person in the flesh staring at the public. And in both cases, it was incomprehensible. Why choose to show this kind of romantic picnic in the luncheon on the grass, or this scene from a brothel or a boudoir in Olympia?
Families went to see exhibitions with Manet's paintings to laugh at them. Really, contemporaries understood nothing about this extraordinary painting that was very different from what they were used to seeing.
In 1863 and 1865, it was hard to understand how one could claim to be a follower of Titian or Raphael and propose images so vulgar, so ugly and brutal. He thought that this was the only hope of saving historical painting. It had to catch up with the world, with reality and with its public.
Until his death in 1883, Manet would be misunderstood by the public and by critics, who would constantly call him a scandal and would ridicule and despise this artist who persisted in taunting them.
Manet cannot tell the difference between a face and a pair of slippers.
As for Berthe, she entered the Paris Salon with her sister Edma as early as 1864. She would exhibit there for 10 years. Unlike Manet, she did not create a scandal, but perhaps even worse, she was simply disdained or ignored. In the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, she was hastily categorized with other female artists among the peintres de ménage, as one would say, femmes de ménage, or cleaning women. In 1873, Berthe exhibited for the last time at the Paris Salon and turned to the avant-garde. She signed the charter which, under an independent banner, brought together artists who were still unknown. Their names were Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Pissarro. Painters who, after their first group exhibition on April 15, 1874, would be called the Impressionists.
In the 1870s, when she exhibited with the Impressionists, she was still criticized, as were her friends, for her painting's sketchy and unfinished style, given the criteria at the time. So she was the target of very strong criticism.
5 or 6 mad individuals, including a woman, a wretched group suffering from the madness called ambition, had decided to meet there and exhibit their work.
The wrath of the public and the critics was let loose against these artists and their paintings, which they judged had been done too hastily. Berthe seemed to come out of it unscathed, but really, the criticism against her was even more pernicious, and especially more contemptuous.
The ambiguity is that they wanted to see Berthe Morisot's work through her femininity, her status as a woman, without trying to pinpoint what was original about it.
I think Berthe Morisot has suffered, up until now, from this reductive approach to her painting. What they thought was feminine was what they said about her painting, the way you would compose a flower bouquet, for instance. But also they thought her subjects were feminine. Indeed, we can see that Berthe Morisot often stuck to the private sphere and painted mostly scenes of motherhood. We can also see that Renoir too dealt with these topics, and that he himself painted many scenes of family intimacy, especially after he became a father. Berthe Morisot also focused on this sphere of family intimacy after she became a mother, when her daughter Julie was born.
Quand sa fille Julie est née.
Within the Impressionist group, Monet was the virtuoso of light, Renoir the master of color and sensuality. As for Berthe Morisot, she remained on the sidelines, far from the glory enjoyed by the other painters. But little by little, the passage of time lent discreet and exceptional harmony to her work. French Academy member Paul Valéry found that Berthe's work as a whole made him imagine what the diary of a woman would be who had chosen to express herself with sketches and color.
They recognized her talent, her quality as a painter, and I would say the strength of her character. She was a woman who would become an attraction point for all these artists, who would acknowledge her as their equal.
Starting in 1874, Berthe Morisot once and for all turned her back on tradition. She chose freedom, the freedom to paint, away from all influence, starting with that of her brother-in-law, Edouard Manet.
Until recently, Berthe Morisot has often been presented as a disciple of Manet. She never was Manet's disciple in the primary sense of the word. She had exchanged with him, but the same way Degas did, or Renoir. I mean, he was the artist. He was a bit older than the other Impressionists. In a way, he had preceded them as early as the 1860s on this road to modern painting. So he had prestige, and Berthe Morisot was absolutely not the only one to be under his influence. Manet was something of a teacher for this new generation of artists, whether they were men or women.
Impressionists saw Manet as the one who paved the way. He was the one who faced the Salon's jury for the first time in the field of this new modern painting, this new realism that was so different from Courbet's. And in 1870, Fontaine-Latour painted the Batignolles studio, where Manet was at his easel. Surrounding him were those who 4 years later would become known as the Impressionists, and who were represented as the master's disciples.
Designated in spite of himself as a leader of the Impressionists, Manet never accepted to participate in their exhibitions, not even once. He even strongly recommended that Berthe Morisot not get close to these marginal artists. He was not done looking for honors. The public seemed to be approaching him at last with less sarcasm and hysteria. Why would he take the risk of losing it all when success seemed to be within reach?
He did not believe in the strategy of the Impressionists. He would support them, buy some paintings, and he lent money to Monet and Renoir. He had been previously close to Basile, had even written to journalists to tell them, you must support this painting. You might understand it one day, but you have to support it now. It incarnates something new and legitimate, even if he himself did not necessarily share its aesthetics and style. Manet had a kind of intellectual dandyism, which was rarely found in Impressionists for whom painting was more literal, perhaps even more superficial. With Manet, there was this will to introduce in his painting elements that would only be understood within his circle.
For example, who was this little boy hardly sketched in the shadows, in the background? Only those close to the artist were able to identify the young Léon Linhof, Manet's son-in-law. He was 11 years old when Manet married his mother. Manet refused to recognize him and forced him to call him godfather.
So there were beginnings of fiction, of narration and of storylines in Manet's painting. We have a tendency to forget them for the benefit of shape alone, but they did exist and formed the richness of this painting. But this richness played against Manet's work in the 1860s because it irritated the critics, who were expecting painting to provide them with a user's manual. One had to immediately understand what it was about. The critics close to Courbet would say to him, "This painting is like a charade, a sphinx. It is not so easy to understand."
Please close this window. What I am saying, Monsieur Manet, is in your own interest.
While Manet's paintings were full of secrets, mysterious and rich with references and hidden tributes, the road Berthe chose was radically different. She wanted to be the painter of her own life.
Never in Berthe Morisot would we find any realism. Realism was foreign to her nature. She was deeply poetic, so what she represented were scenes of life under a certain light. Along with Monet, obviously, I believe she was really the painter of light.
We can see, as she said in her notes, that what she wanted was to capture a moment of what was going on.
The furtive, the ephemeral, the ungraspable, unfinished shapes, mixed pastel colors, sometimes simply a line. I think she got close to genius in certain paintings she did in the Bois de Boulogne. She painted the lake, or a swan on the lake, or the sky that was a bit the same color as the lake waters. All that mixed in a kind of iridescent white, close to abstraction. These are really very astonishing paintings.
This type of impressionist sketching created a scandal and was often rejected. But with this, she would go very far, farther than some of her colleagues, such as Renoir, for example.
Berthe and Manet spent time together for 15 years. Given this, can we imagine that Manet had no power over Berthe's painting? That his way of painting had no influence on her?
Yes, of course, Manet had an influence on Berthe Morisot's painting. I would say Manet, Degas, Fantin-Latour, who, through their types of portraits, their chromatic ranges, influenced Berthe Morisot the way Corot influenced her in the beginning. What was important for Berthe was to use and absorb all this creation as she would with a more classical painting, and to use it as a toolbox to make original artwork. As long as she felt she was under the influence of this or that master, it was unbearable for her, and she would destroy her painting. That is the reason we have nearly no paintings by Berthe Morisot from before 1869, 1870.
Avant 1869-1870.
Painting was for her an undeniable conquest. Nothing and no one would sway her from it. She hated for anyone to impose his ideas on her, even the master Edouard Manet.
Berthe had done a portrait of her mother and sister, which she was planning to send to the Salon. Manet showed up at her house and immediately said, "That is very good," and began to make changes to the painting. And Berthe, in her correspondence, described that moment which she lived like a wound and a humiliation. Eventually, the painting was sent to the Salon against her will. That was for her a horror, the supreme humiliation.
Here is where my misfortune starts. Once engaged, nothing can stop Manet. He goes from the petticoat to the bodice, from the bodice to the head, from the head to the forehead. He makes 1,000 jokes, laughs like crazy, hands me the palette, takes it back. And then at 5 in the afternoon, we had made the prettiest caricature you could see. My mother found the adventure amusing. I find it saddening. I would rather be at the bottom of the river than to find out my painting was accepted at the Salon.
So Manet sometimes allowed himself to change Berthe's paintings. But was he himself influenced by her way of painting?
This was a two-way dialogue, since Berthe Morisot, just like Monet and Renoir, contributed to leading Manet on this road to nature, to explore its effects, to lighten his palette, and to paint in gardens and elsewhere outdoors.
We would find paintings by Manet in which the strokes were freer and had become more visible, and it was indisputably under the influence, the contact with these young artists.
And it is probably thanks to Berthe and her influence that we owe many paintings, of flowers especially, by Manet. So there was certainly an influence, a two-way influence between these two painters.
Can we go beyond this simple observation of reciprocal influence? Was there artistic dialogue between the two painters? Could we see traces of it in their paintings?
Both painted outdoors. For example, Julie was playing in the garden with a watering can, and so we see the two artists being interested in the same subject, the same outdoor effects at the same time.
After she married Eugène, the artistic rivalry was different. It no longer went both ways. This is what was very interesting in the last stage of Manet's painting. His style then was very feminine, focused on Paris fashion, with shiny colors, more sparkling designs, and quicker execution. In fact, it was very comparable to what Berthe Morisot was doing at that very moment. So the exchange was different, and it lengthened their first meeting. It was proof that this relationship was no doubt one of the strongest and most productive of Manet's career.
On April 30th, 1883, Edouard Manet died of syphilis at the age of 51, after 10 days of unbearable agony. Afterwards, Berthe continued to wear the dresses, ribbons, and black hats that Manet liked so much. For her entire life, she remained faithful to the memory of the painter, acting as the flag-bearer of his supporters. It was she who launched the long battle to re-establish his name and work when, beginning in 1884, she organized a major posthumous exhibit at the Beaux-Arts School. It was the very first retrospective of Manet's paintings.
I will never forget the old days of friendship and intimacy with him while I was posing for him. His charming ways had a hold on me for those long hours.
And from time to time, in certain later works, I'm thinking, for example, of a beautiful portrait of Julie playing the violin, a large, full portrait. Berthe Morisot slipped in something from one of his portraits, done by Manet some 20 years earlier. So his painting continued to nourish her and be part of her environment.
So I think their meeting can be explained by a number of factors. The love story was very important. Was that the reason why, for example, Berthe Morisot bought several paintings later on? At the exhibit organized by Théodore Duret, a key figure in 1874, she bought at full price his portrait with violets, which today is in the Orsay Museum. I find there is something very touching in that purchase.
"12 years later, at the age of 54, Berthe died suddenly of lung congestion that she had contracted while taking care of her daughter Julie, who had the flu.
When she passed away in 1895, Renoir was in Aix-en-Provence, painting alongside Cézanne. When he received the telegram announcing the death of Berthe, he dropped everything. He forgot his cane and his hat and put down his brushes. He took the first train to be at her funeral. On that day, he said, "Life is a desert," because for Renoir, Berthe's presence was very, very important in Impressionist circles. 1 year after her death, it was her best friends, that is Renoir, Degas, Monet, and Mallarmé, who organized a retrospective of her work. They themselves took charge of hanging Berthe's paintings at the Durand-Ruel Gallery. It was there at that moment that people understood that this woman had produced a serious body of work.
This exhibit was a revelation. Imagine that during her entire life, Berthe Morisot presented only 5 canvases, a selection of 5 watercolors together, each a very partial vision of her work. Here, 300 pieces of work were on exhibit. The public could discover her talent as a painter, but also as an artist doing sketches and watercolors.
In the end, we could say that her painting, in spite of her delectable, almost giddy appearance, her painting was a struggle to be an artist and a woman at the same time, and to establish a balance between these two roles in her life.
Just before her death, Berthe found the force to write one last letter to her daughter.
My dear Julie, as I lie dying, I love you, and I will still love you when I am dead. Please don't cry. This separation was inevitable. I would have liked to go on until your marriage. Work and be good as you always have been. In your life, you have brought me no worries. You have beauty and good fortune. Make good use of it. And tell Monsieur Degas that if he opens a museum, he should choose a Manet canvas.
Julie was Berthe's only real passion, aside from art with a capital A. And Julie devoted her entire life to having the paintings of her mother known and acknowledged. She was the guardian of her paintings and her heritage. Berthe was buried in the Passy Cemetery in the Manet family vault, next to her husband Eugène, and next to Edouard Manet. Today, the paintings of Manet and Berthe hang on the walls of the most important museums. But it was not until 1907, nearly a quarter of a century after the death of Manet, that his Olympia was given its place in the Louvre. On the other hand, Berthe had the pleasure of seeing, while she was still alive, her young girl in a ball gown exhibited in a room of the Luxembourg Museum. She passed away a year later.
Mallarmé understood what had transpired between Manet and Berthe Morisot. Manet had seen something in her, a sort of potential, as we would say today, that had to be developed, that was asking to be developed. And in a sense, perhaps he was the person who allowed Berthe Morisot to become her real self.